are about to hear is a dramatized debate built for political analysis and rhetorical study, not a literal transcript of any single real hearing. Byron Donalds looked straight at Nancy Pelosi and said, with a calm voice that sounded sharper than shouting, that power turns poisonous when it starts treating questions like crimes. The audience froze because the line did not accuse her of a single vote, but of building a culture where scrutiny itself becomes unacceptable. A woman in the gallery blurted out why he was coming at her so hard instead of talking policy like a normal person. And a few others echoed the same complaint. Donalds paused, faced the main camera, and said that if viewers wanted the real reason for the confrontation, they needed to stay until the very end of this video. Here is my view, and I am going to state it plainly because audiences deserve clarity instead of coyness that pretends neutrality while smuggling conclusions. I think Washington's worst habit is not corruption as a dramatic headline, but narrative protection as an everyday reflex, where reputations are defended faster than facts are tested. I also think Donalds is playing a high-risk strategy because he is trying to force an institution to discuss incentives out loud, and institutions hate that more than they hate insults. At the same time, I think Pelosi is too experienced to be caught off guard by volume, so she will try to win by redefining the argument, not by answering it. That is the chessboard, and once you see it, every sentence in this exchange stops sounding like improvisation and starts sounding like calculation. Pelosi opened with the kind of authority that comes from years of controlling a room without needing to remind anyone she can control it. She framed Donalds as a performer who benefits from outrage, implying that his rising profile depends on turning governance into a spectacle that audiences can binge like entertainment. She then pivoted to institutional language, describing leadership as the art of keeping fragile coalitions together, even when activists demand purity and opponents demand surrender. The crowd responded the way crowds often do when they hear a familiar script delivered with confidence, because familiarity feels like competence even when it is mostly repetition. Donalds listened with stillness that looked like respect, but was really the posture of a man letting his opponent spend ammunition before he reveals what game he came to play. When Donalds spoke, he did not deny that spectacle exists, because denying it would have sounded naive in a room filled with cameras and careers. He argued that spectacle becomes inevitable when leaders treat oversight as disloyalty, because then the only way to get answers is to create public pressure that cannot be ignored. He said the argument is not whether institutions matter, but whether institutions can survive if they demand trust, while refusing transparency when trust is questioned. A few people laughed when he quipped that some politicians love the word accountability the way people love the word gym, because they talk about it constantly while avoiding the actual workout. Pelosi smiled briefly, not amused, but aware that humor lands on audiences faster than policy does, which is why she has used it herself when it serves her. The moderator tried to steer them toward substance by asking what exactly Donalds believed had become untouchable in modern political culture. Donalds answered that the untouchable thing is the assumption that seniority equals virtue, because seniority can just as easily equal skill at avoiding consequences. Pelosi interjected that experience is not a shield but a tool, and that governing is not a series of viral moments, but a series of hard compromises under imperfect information. Donalds replied that compromise is not the same as concealment, and that compromise does not require citizens to stop asking who benefits and who pays. The tension rose because the debate was no longer about left versus right, but about whether the public is allowed to interrogate power without being morally indicted for doing so. An audience member asked whether Donalds was targeting Pelosi simply because she was a famous symbol, and whether that was fair or useful. He answered that symbols matter because symbols teach the public what behaviors are rewarded, and long careers often become the brand label for a political operating system. Pelosi countered that focusing on symbols invites demagoguery because it reduces complex institutions to personal villains and personal heroes. And that is a dangerous simplification. Donalds agreed that simplification is dangerous, then added that complexity is also dangerous when it becomes a hiding place, because people cannot hold accountable what they cannot see. The crowd shifted in their seats because both points felt true, and when two truths collide, people become anxious about which one they are allowed to say out loud. Pelosi then moved to a strategy she has mastered for decades, which is turning the debate into a question of motives instead of a question of claims. She suggested that Donald's approach was less about oversight and more about delegitimizing the institution itself, because attacking leadership can weaken the House when it faces external threats. Donalds responded that oversight strengthens institutions when it is honest, and that institutions decay subsist when leaders treat questioning as sabotage. He added that citizens can smell fear disguised as principle, and that fear often sounds like a lecture about why the public must behave more responsibly than the politicians they elect. Pelosi's expression tightened, because he was implying that her moral framing could be a mask for control, and she understood how persuasive that implication can be. The debate took a sharper turn when Pelosi accused Donalds of using insinuation, arguing that insinuation is the easiest weapon because it demands suspicion without supplying proof. Donalds replied that insinuation becomes popular when official answers are polished but incomplete, because people fill gaps with whatever story feels consistent with what they already distrust. He said that if leaders want fewer rumors, they should stop treating transparency like a concession and start treating it like the baseline cost of legitimacy. Pelosi answered that transparency without guardrails can turn into harassment, and that people in public life are not obligated to entertain every accusation that trends on social media. Donalds responded that accountability is not harassment, and that refusing to answer hard questions because the questions are uncomfortable is how distrust becomes permanent. At that moment, a young man in the balcony shouted again, asking why Donalds was going after her, and why he could not just debate taxes or spending like normal politicians. Donalds looked up and repeated, with the same calm rhythm, that the reason would become obvious by the end, because the debate is about the rules of the game, not only the plays. He said that policy debates mean little when the public believes the referees protect certain players from scrutiny, because then every outcome looks rigged, no matter who wins. Pelosi responded that such rhetoric is exactly how democracies get weakened from the inside, because it trains citizens to treat every institution as illegitimate. Donalds replied that legitimacy is not a demand. It is an earned condition, and earned conditions require leaders who can withstand questions without turning them into moral scandals. The first phase ended with both speakers still standing on their chosen ground, neither conceding the central premise of the other. Pelosi wanted the audience to fear what happens when trust collapses, because fear is a powerful glue for coalitions that feel threatened. Donalds wanted the audience to question why trust is demanded so aggressively, because demanding trust is often a sign that persuasion has stopped working. If you felt pulled in both directions, that does not mean you were confused, because it means you were seeing the real conflict that defines modern American politics. And if you are still asking why Donalds opened with that shock line against Pelosi, keep watching, because the next phase is where the personal stakes and political calculations start to intersect. Pelosi did not respond to Donalds by matching his tone, because she knew the audience would mistake volume for insecurity and calm for control. Instead, She reframed his opening line as a performance designed to generate suspicion, arguing that suspicion is the easiest political product to sell because it requires no policy blueprint. She reminded the room that government runs on imperfect information and that people who have never carried responsibility underestimate the damage caused by reckless accusations. Donalds listened, then nodded once, almost politely, as if he were granting her the courtesy of finishing a script he had heard 100 times. He replied that the public is not asking leaders to be flawless, but to be explainable, because trust collapses fastest when power refuses to speak plainly. Pelosi pressed him on what he meant by explainable, because she understood that vague demands for transparency can become a trap that punishes anyone who tries to answer. Donalds answered that explainable means a leader can describe how decisions are made, who influences those decisions, and why the same small circle keeps benefiting from access. He added that even when nothing illegal occurs, the optics of privilege can still rot legitimacy because citizens know the difference between public service and private comfort. Pelosi countered that optics are often manipulated, and that her critics use insinuation to turn normal governance into scandal theater for clicks. Donalds responded that optics become weaponized only when leaders refuse to treat them as signals, because ignoring signals is how institutions learn arrogance. The moderator asked a sharper question, because the audience was clearly hungry for something more concrete than philosophy and tone management. He asked whether Pelosi believed there should be stricter rules on lawmakers and family financial conflicts, including limitations on stock trading and private sector consulting access. Pelosi answered that she supports ethics reforms in principle, but warned against simplistic rules that punish legitimate investment and discourage qualified people from serving. Donalds replied that the public is tired of principle without deadlines, because principle is cheap and enforcement is expensive, and power always budgets for itself first. He then asked a controversial question that hung in the air like smoke, asking why reform always becomes urgent, only after public anger becomes unavoidable. Pelosi attempted to pivot toward her legislative record, listing achievements in healthcare, labor protections, and civil rights advancement, as if the resume itself could end the argument. Donalds did not dismiss her record, which surprised some people, but he questioned whether accomplishments excuse the culture of insulation that grows around long-serving leadership. He said he had met voters who do not hate Pelosi personally, but who feel the political class speaks a private language that never translates into rent payments or safer streets. Pelosi responded that governance is not a retail transaction, and that reducing policy to personal grievances is how demagogues dismantle serious institutions. Donalds replied that citizens sound like they have grievances when leaders stop treating them like adults who can handle honest explanations. A man in the audience raised his hand and asked why Pelosi looked irritated whenever Donalds said the word accountability, as if accountability were an insult instead of a standard. Pelosi answered that she was not irritated by accountability, but by the assumption that accountability means public shaming, because shaming is entertainment, not oversight. Donalds responded that public shaming becomes popular when private oversight appears toothless, because people cannot respect a referee who never throws a flag. He added a line that drew uneasy laughter, saying that Washington has a talent for launching investigations the way restaurants launch soft openings, because it always feels temporary and never affects the menu. Pelosi smiled tightly again, because she understood the joke was not about restaurants, but about institutions that perform seriousness without consequences. The moderator pressed Donalds on whether his approach risked fueling conspiratorial thinking, because viewers on YouTube often confuse pointed rhetoric with confirmed evidence. Donalds answered carefully that he refuses to traffic in fantasies because fantasies make money fast but destroy credibility permanently. And credibility is the only currency that outlasts cycles. He said his focus was not secret plots, but open incentives, and he argued that when incentives reward opacity, citizens should assume opacity will grow. Pelosi responded that incentives are not destiny, and that good leaders use power responsibly even in imperfect systems, which is why she resented being treated as a symbol of rot. Donalds replied that being a symbol is not an insult, but a consequence of longevity, because the longer someone leads, the more the system starts wearing their face. Pelosi then challenged Donalds directly, asking whether he was willing to apply the same scrutiny to members of his own party, including donors, lobbyists, and celebrity commentators. Donalds said yes, and he emphasized that selective outrage is the fastest way to become a hypocrite with a microphone, which is a job Washington already has too many applicants for. He stated that his problem is not with Democrats alone, but with any political class that treats reform as a branding exercise rather than a discipline with teeth. Pelosi responded that broad cynicism is lazy because it flattens meaningful differences and encourages voters to disengage rather than build. Donalds countered that cynicism is not the goal, but that honesty sometimes sounds cynical when people have been trained to expect only speeches. An audience member asked a blunt and slightly provocative question about whether Pelosi's generation of leadership stays in power because it believes it is uniquely capable or because it fears losing control. Pelosi answered that the question itself reflected the disrespect of a culture that confuses age with weakness, and she reminded the room that competence does not expire on a birthday. Donalds agreed that competence does not expire, but he asked whether humility does, because the healthiest institutions are those where leaders plan for succession instead of treating succession like betrayal. He added that democracy is supposed to be a relay, not a throne, and that holding the baton too long makes everyone behind you trip. Pelosi responded that he was romanticizing transition, and she warned that sudden leadership vacuums can be exploited by extremists who do not respect the rules at all. Donalds did not deny that risk, but he asked why the public is always told to fear what happens after powerful leaders leave, as if institutions cannot function without specific personalities. He said that if an institution collapses when one person steps aside, then the problem is not the stepping aside, but the concentration of power that made collapse possible. Pelosi replied that she had spent years building coalitions precisely so the institution would not collapse, and she argued that critics confuse stability with self-interest. Donalds responded that stability becomes suspicious when it coincides too neatly with comfort for insiders and stagnation for outsiders, because patterns matter even when no single act is criminal. The room grew quieter because he was pulling the argument away from courtroom language and toward moral legitimacy, which is harder to dismiss with technicalities. The moderator introduced a new angle by asking both Pelosi and Donalds how they would write rules that reduce conflicts without punishing ordinary investing or discouraging service. Pelosi suggested reforms centered on disclosure and enforcement resources, arguing that transparency requires funding and expertise, not just slogans and televised outrage. Donalds agreed, then said disclosure without limits is like a speedometer without speed limits, because it measures behavior while pretending measurement alone will change it. He asked a controversial question that made several people inhale sharply, asking whether politicians are comfortable letting voters see everything because they know voters cannot punish what they cannot understand. Pelosi responded that voters are smarter than he was implying, and she accused him of flirting with the idea that the public is helpless, which she rejected. Donalds clarified that he was not insulting voters but challenging the political class for intentionally complicating systems, because complexity can be used as a moat. Pelosi replied that complexity is often the price of governing a large, diverse nation, and she warned that simplifiers often become authoritarians when reality refuses to cooperate. Donalds answered that simplification becomes dangerous when it lies, but clarity becomes powerful when it tells the truth in plain language, and he insisted leaders should aim for clarity whenever possible. He added a quiet piece of satire, saying that Washington loves the phrase unintended consequences because it sounds like an apology, but it often functions like a permission slip. Pelosi exhaled through her nose, almost a laugh, because the line was sharp enough to sting, but measured enough to avoid cheap cruelty. By the end of this phase, the audience was no longer asking whether Byron Donalds was being too aggressive toward Nancy Pelosi, because the argument had moved beyond personal heat. Instead, the real question became whether American politics can survive if its leaders keep treating accountability as an attack and explanations as optional. Pelosi looked composed, but more guarded now, because she sensed Donalds was building toward something more specific than philosophical critique. Donalds looked patient, almost clinical, because he was letting the audience understand the frame before he introduced the evidence within that frame. And if you are still wondering why he opened with that shock line, the next segment is where the stakes tighten, because the debate stops being about theory and starts touching the machinery that protects power. The third movement of the exchange unfolded with a noticeable shift in rhythm, because once abstract arguments about accountability are established, the next step is always pressure. Pelosi sensed it coming and tried to anchor the discussion back to procedure, reminding viewers that Congress is governed by rules precisely to prevent debates from turning into personal tribunals. She warned that blurring lines between critique and accusation can corrode norms faster than any single bad actor ever could. Donalds acknowledged the importance of rules, then replied that rules lose moral force when they appear to protect insiders more effectively than the public interest. The audience felt the pivot, because this was the moment when theory began edging toward uncomfortable specificity. I want to pause here and be explicit about my own judgment, because pretending detachment at this point would be dishonest. What Donalds is doing rhetorically is not claiming secret crimes, but highlighting incentive structures that reward proximity to power while punishing transparency. What Pelosi is defending is not merely her own record, but the legitimacy of a system that depends on trust in long-serving leadership. Both positions can coexist logically, but emotionally they are irreconcilable, because one asks for faith while the other demands proof. That tension is why audiences lean forward instead of checking their phones. Pelosi accused Donalds of encouraging suspicion by implication, suggesting that he was inviting viewers to connect dots without evidence. She argued that this style of rhetoric poisons civic culture, because it trains people to see corruption everywhere, even when processes are lawful. Donalds responded that implication fills the vacuum left by silence, and that the antidote to suspicion is not scolding, but explanation. He said leaders underestimate how much detail citizens can handle, because simplicity is often chosen for convenience, not clarity. The room absorbed that line because it challenged the assumption that the public is too fragile for truth. The moderator intervened again, asking whether Donalds believed financial and professional boundaries around lawmakers should be tightened, even if no wrongdoing is proven. Donalds answered that boundaries are not punishments, but guardrails, and that guardrails exist precisely because humans are predictable when incentives align too neatly with self-interest. Pelosi countered that excessive restrictions could deter talented people from public service, turning Congress into a body of the independently wealthy or ideologically extreme. Donalds replied that Congress already appears that way to many voters, and that perception alone should worry anyone who cares about legitimacy. A murmur ran through the audience because perception, fair or not, has real political consequences. Pelosi leaned forward and asked Donalds whether he was comfortable fueling distrust in an era already saturated with misinformation. He answered that misinformation thrives where institutions refuse to explain themselves, because people invent stories to replace silence. He stressed that he was not alleging secret conspiracies, but openly questioning whether the system rewards the same families, networks, and relationships over time. Pelosi replied that networks exist in every profession, and that politics is not uniquely guilty of human behavior. Donalds responded that politics is uniquely dangerous when it stops interrogating that behavior, because power amplifies consequences. At this point, a member of the audience asked a question that was phrased politely but landed sharply, asking why lawmakers resist reforms that would clearly separate public duty from private benefit. Pelosi answered that reforms require balance, because crude solutions often create loopholes larger than the problems they claim to fix. Donalds replied that delay is also a choice, and that choosing delay often benefits those already comfortable with the status quo. He added, with dry humor, that Washington treats reform like a software update, always promised in the next version, never installed on the current one. Even Pelosi let out a brief laugh, because the metaphor was uncomfortably accurate. The conversation then drifted toward generational tension, though neither participant named it directly at first. Pelosi spoke about institutional memory, warning that tearing down experienced leadership can leave newer members unprepared for geopolitical realities. Donalds answered that institutional memory should be taught, not hoarded, and that leadership becomes brittle when it equates continuity with indispensability. He said democracy weakens when it starts sounding like a family business instead of a relay race. The metaphor lingered because it reframed succession as stewardship rather than threat. Pelosi bristled slightly at that framing and reminded the audience that she had mentored countless younger lawmakers over the years. Donalds acknowledged that mentorship exists, then asked whether mentorship without meaningful power transfer risks becoming symbolic rather than structural. He argued that symbolism satisfies audiences temporarily, but structural change is what restores trust over time. Pelosi replied that trust is also sustained by results, not just process, and she listed outcomes she believed justified confidence in experienced leadership. Donalds responded that outcomes matter most when they are broadly felt, not concentrated among those already closest to power. A brief exchange of sarcasm followed when Pelosi suggested that Donalds was offering skepticism as a brand, because skepticism polls well in fractured times. Donalds replied that skepticism polls well because people have learned that optimism without accountability often precedes disappointment. He joked lightly that Washington loves optimism the way gamblers love hot streaks, because both encourage risk-taking while ignoring the odds. The audience chuckled, but the humor masked a serious critique about institutional self-delusion. Pelosi recognized it and shifted tactics again, choosing restraint over rebuttal. The moderator asked whether either side believed the other was acting in bad faith, hoping to de-escalate before the exchange hardened. Pelosi said she did not doubt Donalds' sincerity, but questioned the consequences of his approach in a polarized media environment. Donalds said he did not doubt Pelosi's commitment, but questioned whether commitment alone justifies insulation from scrutiny. He added that good faith does not exempt leaders from hard questions, especially when they hold influence for decades. That mutual acknowledgement cooled the tone, but did not resolve the disagreement. As this phase drew to a close, it became clear that the argument was no longer about any single policy or personality. It was about whether American political culture treats longevity as proof of virtue or as a variable that demands closer inspection. Pelosi stood for the idea that continuity protects institutions from chaos. Donalds stood for the idea that continuity without challenge breeds complacency and resentment. And by now, the audience understood why the opening line had been so sharp, because the conflict beneath it was structural, not personal, and the next phase would make that unmistakable. The fourth phase of the confrontation began quietly, which in politics is often more dangerous than noise, because silence creates space for meaning to harden. Pelosi adjusted her posture and chose her words with surgical care, signaling that she was shifting from defense to reframing the narrative itself. She spoke about experience not as entitlement, but as accumulated responsibility, arguing that long tenure creates a deeper understanding of consequences that younger voices sometimes underestimate. She warned that tearing down established leadership without a clear replacement strategy risks leaving power vacuums that are quickly filled by less accountable forces. The audience sensed the appeal to caution, because fear of instability is a powerful motivator. Donalds did not interrupt, which was deliberate, because letting an argument breathe often reveals its weakest seams. When he responded, he did not challenge the value of experience, but questioned who benefits when experience becomes synonymous with permanence. He said that wisdom is proven when leaders know when to step back, not when they learn how to stay indefinitely. That line landed heavily because it reframed retirement and succession not as loss, but as moral choices. The room grew still because the implication extended far beyond the two people speaking. I need to underline something here, because this is where the debate stops being abstract and starts cutting close to home for viewers. The tension is not between youth and age, but between renewal and consolidation, between systems that rotate power and systems that recycle it. Pelosi embodies continuity in its most disciplined form, while Donalds embodies disruption framed as accountability rather than rebellion. Neither position is inherently illegitimate, but democracy strains when continuity forgets to justify itself. That strain is what audiences feel, even if they cannot articulate it in policy terms. Pelosi responded by invoking crises she had lived through, moments when institutional knowledge prevented catastrophe. She suggested that skepticism towards senior leadership often spikes during stable periods, because success makes vigilance look unnecessary. Donalds countered that stability can mask fragility, because systems often appear strongest right before they fail. He compared political institutions to aging bridges, still standing, still useful, but increasingly dependent on trust that no one inspects too closely. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the room because the image was uncomfortably vivid. An audience member asked whether Donalds was effectively arguing for term limits without saying the words. He smiled slightly and said, "Term limits are one tool, but culture matters more than calendars." He argued that even without formal limits, leaders can cultivate successors instead of neutralizing them. Pelosi replied that succession is not sabotage, but she questioned whether Donalds's framing encouraged cynicism rather than responsibility. He answered that cynicism grows fastest where questions are discouraged, not where they are asked. At this point, humor crept back in, briefly disarming the tension. Donalds joked that Washington treats power like a rental car with unlimited mileage, because no one wants to be the one who returns it scratched. Pelosi responded dryly that some people drive the car hard without learning how the engine works. The exchange drew laughter, but beneath it was a real disagreement about stewardship versus entitlement. Comedy softened the moment, but it did not dilute its meaning. The moderator shifted focus to public trust, asking whether either side believed trust could be rebuilt without significant institutional change. Pelosi said trust is rebuilt through results that improve lives, not through symbolic sacrifices that satisfy outrage cycles. Donalds answered that results and sacrifice are not mutually exclusive, and that visible accountability strengthens the credibility of results. He argued that when leaders voluntarily accept constraints, citizens are more likely to believe claims of good faith. That argument resonated because it framed restraint as strength rather than weakness. Pelosi pushed back by saying that constant suspicion erodes the ability to govern, because leaders become paralyzed by fear of misinterpretation. Donalds replied that fear of scrutiny should not outweigh fear of betrayal, especially when public trust is already thin. He noted that citizens tolerate mistakes more easily than secrecy, because mistakes feel human while secrecy feels calculated. The audience nodded, because many had experienced that dynamic outside politics. Trust, once broken, rarely returns through reassurance alone. Another question came from the crowd, asking why criticism often feels harsher when it comes from within the same demographic or ideological community. Pelosi answered that internal criticism can feel like betrayal because it undermines collective defense against external threats. Donalds responded that internal criticism is often the only kind that leads to reform, because it cannot be dismissed as ignorance or hostility. He added that loyalty without honesty is not loyalty at all. It is branding. That line cut sharply, because it challenged the emotional logic of partisan solidarity. As the segment progressed, it became clear that Pelosi was arguing for protection of the institution as a moral priority. Donalds was arguing that institutions earn protection by demonstrating restraint and transparency. The clash was philosophical rather than procedural, which made compromise difficult. Neither was speaking carelessly, and neither was improvising. This was a collision of worldviews shaped by very different political journeys. Near the end of this phase, Pelosi asked Donalds directly whether he believed people like her should step aside simply because of how long they had served. He answered carefully, saying longevity alone is not disqualifying, but immunity from challenge is. He said leaders should welcome scrutiny as confirmation that their authority still rests on consent, not inertia. Pelosi did not immediately respond, which was rare, and the pause itself carried weight. The audience felt that something unresolved had been named. As the lights shifted and the moderator prepared to move forward, the mood had changed again. The debate was no longer about individual decisions or past controversies. It was about whether American leadership understands the difference between guarding democracy and owning it. Pelosi and Donalds stood on opposite sides of that line, each convinced they were defending the same ideal. And by the end of this section, viewers knew the next stage would test not just arguments, but consequences. The fifth segment carried a heavier emotional weight, because by now the debate had moved beyond abstractions and into the uncomfortable territory of consequences. Pelosi spoke about the cost of erosion, not just to institutions, but to people who rely on continuity for stability, warning that relentless suspicion can fracture coalitions that protect vulnerable communities. She framed leadership as a shield, imperfect but necessary, against forces that thrive on chaos and cynicism. Her voice softened as she described moments when compromise prevented harm, arguing that those moments rarely make headlines because restraint is not dramatic. The room listened because there was sincerity in the appeal, even among those who disagreed. Donalds answered by acknowledging that shields can protect, but they can also hide damage if no one is allowed to look behind them. He said accountability is not the enemy of stability, but its insurance policy, because unchecked authority eventually becomes brittle. He noted that many Americans no longer differentiate between stability and stagnation because both feel immovable from the outside. That perception, he argued, is what fuels disengagement, not the questions themselves. The audience felt the gravity, because disengagement is a quiet failure that accumulates over time. At this point, I want to be clear about where my own reasoning lands, because this exchange exposes a truth that rarely gets spoken plainly. Institutions do not collapse because people criticize them. They collapse because criticism is delayed until trust has already evaporated. Pelosi is right to fear recklessness, and Donalds is right to fear complacency. The danger emerges when fear of disruption outweighs fear of decay. That balance is what modern politics struggles to maintain. A question from the audience cut through the tension, asking whether either side believed personal attacks were unavoidable in high-stakes accountability debates. Pelosi said personal attacks are a sign that substance has failed, and that they corrode discourse even when aimed at powerful figures. Donalds replied that accountability feels personal when power has been personal for a long time. He added that discomfort is often mislabeled as attack when it challenges identity rather than policy. That distinction lingered because it explained why these debates escalate so quickly. The conversation briefly turned to media dynamics, with Pelosi criticizing how clips are weaponized to inflame outrage rather than inform. Donalds agreed that media incentives distort nuance, but argued that leaders cannot outsource their credibility to editors and producers. He said transparency is the only message that survives selective editing, because it leaves less room for speculation. Pelosi countered that transparency without context can mislead just as easily as secrecy. Donalds answered that context must be provided, not presumed, especially when trust is already strained. A moment of dry humor broke the tension when Donalds remarked that Washington loves panels and task forces the way gyms love unused memberships, because both look impressive without producing results. Pelosi smiled thinly and replied that some people confuse motion with progress, mistaking constant disruption for reform. The exchange drew laughter, but also underscored how differently they measure effectiveness. One measured it by stability over time, the other by visible correction of imbalance. Neither metric was frivolous, and that complexity kept the room engaged. The moderator asked a final question for this segment, pressing both speakers on whether they believed the system could self-correct without external pressure. Pelosi said institutions have internal mechanisms for reform, but they require patience and good faith to function. Donalds replied that internal mechanisms often activate only after external pressure exposes failure. He argued that sunlight does not destroy institutions, it forces them to evolve. The audience sensed the inevitability of that logic, even if it felt uncomfortable. As this phase neared its end, Pelosi made a candid observation, admitting that longevity can create blind spots even in well-intentioned leaders. She said, "The challenge is recognizing those blind spots without allowing critics to define one's entire legacy by them." Donalds responded that legacies are not defined by criticism, but by how leaders respond to it. He said humility is the rarest trait in high office, precisely because power insulates those who hold it. That line landed quietly, but it stayed with people. The emotional undercurrent shifted again, because the debate was no longer framed as winner versus loser. It became a meditation on responsibility, on how power ages, and on whether leaders see accountability as threat or obligation. Pelosi looked reflective rather than combative, while Donalds looked resolute rather than triumphant. Both understood that the audience was not judging policy details anymore, but character and philosophy. And by the end of this section, it was clear that the final stage would not be about argument at all, but about what kind of political future Americans are willing to tolerate. The final movement arrived without spectacle, which made it feel heavier, because conclusions in politics rarely announce themselves with applause. The moderator invited closing reflections, and the room settled into a kind of attentive stillness that suggested people were no longer waiting to react, but to decide. Pelosi spoke first, choosing restraint over flourish, and said that history is often harsher than contemporaries because it compresses complexity into verdicts. She argued that institutions survive not because leaders are flawless, but because they endure long enough to correct their own mistakes. Her closing appeal was not for personal vindication, but for caution against turning accountability into permanent suspicion. Donalds listened carefully, then took a breath before responding, aware that the last words often echo longer than the sharpest accusations. He said that endurance alone is not virtue, because systems can persist while quietly hollowing out public trust. He argued that accountability is not a phase, not a moment triggered by scandal, but a posture that leaders must maintain continuously. Without that posture, he said, longevity becomes indistinguishable from entitlement in the eyes of those watching from the outside. The audience leaned forward, because this was no longer argument, but diagnosis. I want to state my own conclusion plainly, because ambiguity at this point would feel evasive. This exchange revealed that the real divide is not partisan, generational, or personal, but philosophical. One side believes stability is preserved by shielding institutions from constant challenge. The other believes stability is preserved by inviting challenge before resentment turns corrosive. Both instincts exist because both risks are real, but modern politics has leaned too far toward protection and not enough toward explanation. Pelosi closed her remarks by reminding viewers that public service requires compromise with imperfect realities. She warned that demanding purity from institutions often leads to paralysis rather than reform. Donalds responded that compromise loses legitimacy when it consistently benefits the same people and networks. He said reform does not require purity, only honesty about who bears the cost of delay. That framing shifted the room, because cost is something every viewer understands instinctively. An audience member asked a final question that cut through the accumulated theory, asking what accountability should look like when trust is already low. Pelosi answered that rebuilding trust begins with shared outcomes that improve daily life, because people believe what they can feel. Donalds replied that rebuilding trust also requires visible restraint, because people believe what leaders give up voluntarily. He said, sacrifice communicates sincerity faster than any press release ever could. The room absorbed that answer because it translated abstraction into behavior. There was a brief moment of levity when Donalds joked that Washington promises reform the way restaurants promise renovations, always scheduled for next season while serving the same menu. Pelosi smiled, then replied that customers eventually stop coming if the menu never changes. The exchange drew laughter, but it also served as a quiet concession that stagnation carries political risk. Humor here did not deflect the truth, it underscored it. Sometimes jokes survive because they describe reality too accurately to ignore. As the moderator signaled the end, the tone shifted from confrontation to reflection. Pelosi looked composed but thoughtful, aware that the questions raised would not disappear after the cameras turned off. Donalds looked steady rather than celebratory, as if he understood that challenging power carries responsibility beyond the moment. Neither appeared victorious in the traditional sense. Instead, Both seemed aware that the audience would carry the real verdict. The lasting impact of this debate was not a viral line or a decisive rebuttal, but an unresolved question that lingered in the room. Should trust in leadership be assumed until disproven, or earned continuously through transparency and restraint? Pelosi believes the former protects institutions from chaos. Donalds believes the latter protects institutions from decay. That disagreement will not be settled by one debate, or one election, or one generation. As viewers began to file out, the conversations were quieter, more introspective, less performative than earlier. People were not repeating talking points, but asking each other what accountability should actually demand. That shift mattered more than applause, because it signaled engagement rather than allegiance. Politics changes not when minds are conquered, but when questions replace assumptions. And that, more than any exchange of words, was the true outcome of the night. The cameras faded, but the tension remained, unresolved by design. Because the most honest debates do not end with certainty, they end with responsibility passed to the audience. Whether Americans choose comfort in continuity or courage in scrutiny will shape what leadership looks like next. Pelosi and Donalds offered two coherent visions, neither easily dismissed. The rest of the story belongs to those watching, deciding not who won, but what kind of accountability they are willing to demand.